The universe had grown accustomed to the relentless march of the Zorn. They were a juggernaut, ruthless, pragmatic, and utterly dominant. Their empire stretched across thousands of star systems, an iron grip that crushed any who dared resist. Even the most powerful civilizations had fallen before them, unable to withstand the Zorn's mastery of both technology and tactics. The Zorn didn't just win wars, they eradicated cultures, extinguished entire species with clinical efficiency. Their most feared weapon was their ability to adapt quickly in battle, learning from each encounter, overcoming every obstacle with terrifying precision. The Galactic Coalition had once been a shining beacon of hope and unity, a diverse alliance of species bound by the goal of peace and mutual prosperity. But that was before the Zorn came. For decades, they had held the line, fending off minor skirmishes and border incursions. But the Zorn's invasion had been too much, too fast. The Coalition's fleets were fragmented, their supply lines stretched thin, their worlds falling one after another. What had once seemed like an insurmountable enemy had now become an unstoppable force. The final blow was on the horizon. The Zorn were preparing to launch their most devastating assault yet, the annihilation of the Coalition's homeworld, the heart of the Alliance, the symbol of everything they had stood for. It was a move that would crush any remaining will to resist and send a message to every star system. Resistance was futile. But there was one thing the Zorn hadn't counted on. The Coalition leaders, with no more options left, turned to Earth. For centuries, humans had been content to live within their own borders, developing technology at a steady but unspectacular pace. They had reached the stars, yes, but only in small exploratory groups, and their military capabilities were primitive by galactic standards. The humans had watched the rise and fall of galactic empires from the sidelines, never once considering that they might play a pivotal role in the fate of the galaxy. The request for help came at the worst possible time. The Coalition's government was in disarray, their military on the brink of collapse. The decision to involve Earth was made out of desperation, more out of a faint hope than real expectation. Perhaps their unpredictability might be an advantage. A senior Coalition officer had muttered, her words a final plea as she reviewed the human technological files. On Earth, the response was less than enthusiastic. Governments had their own concerns, economic crises, internal divisions, and resource shortages. To most, the war was something that happened far away, a problem of distant galaxies. But when the message arrived from the Coalition, humanity realized it was time to step up, to either rise to the challenge or be forgotten. Admiral Claire Donovan was the one chosen to lead this strange new venture. A veteran of Earth's fledgling space programs, she was as hard as they came, a woman who had seen humanity's potential in the cold vacuum of space. But even she knew this would be a monumental challenge. Her fleet was small, her ships outdated, and her resources meager. Yet there was something about her. An unshakable conviction, a belief that humans had something the rest of the galaxy did not. The ability to adapt, to innovate, and to fight against impossible odds. And so, the humans made their decision. They would join the fight, though they were unsure if they would succeed. The human fleet, small as it was, prepared for its journey to the Coalition's capital. In the vast expanse of space, one question remained: could humanity, in all its unpredictability, make a difference? And as the human ships surged toward the heart of the war, the galaxy held its breath, unsure of what to expect next. As the human fleet set course for the heart of the war, uncertainty hung heavy in the air. Back on Earth, news of the alliance with the Coalition spread quickly, but the public's reaction was mixed. Some hailed the decision as a necessary step for the survival of the galaxy, while others questioned the wisdom of throwing humanity into a galactic conflict that seemed beyond their capability. Most people, however, simply couldn't fathom the scale of the war. The daily concerns of Earth, political infighting, economic instability, and environmental crisis, seemed far removed from the bloodshed of distant stars. Admiral Claire Donovan stood before a quiet conference table, her face hardened by years of military service, but marked by a growing sense of responsibility. The war was not something she had ever anticipated. Her career had been built on the exploration of space, not on saving it from annihilation. Yet now, she was thrust into the role of humanity's last hope. She had led humanity's fledgling space programs, missions that aimed to explore, to discover, but now her role was to lead a fleet of underprepared ships into the heart of a battle against an enemy whose might was incomprehensible. 5 hours, Donovan muttered to herself as she stared at the tactical display before her. The Coalition had made a bold, desperate prediction. If humanity could turn the tide, it would take just 5 hours to change the course of the war. She didn't know whether to believe it or laugh. How could they? The Zorn had decimated planets in mere hours. How could humans possibly alter the war in that short time? Her fleet was a mix of human-made ships, their technology largely outdated compared to the Zorn's advanced weapon systems. The flagship, Resolute, was an older battleship, but its crew had trained relentlessly for this moment. The rest of the fleet was a patchwork of exploratory vessels, mining ships retrofitted for combat, and a handful of advanced fighters. They lacked the firepower, the advanced shields, or the weaponry of the Zorn, but they did possess something unique: ingenuity. If they were to have any hope, it would be through a different kind of warfare, something the Zorn would never expect. As the fleet passed the final coordinates toward the Coalition's homeworld, Donovan's mind raced. There were no second chances here. The Zorn were ruthless. They wouldn't give the humans time to regroup or rethink. The fight had to be won in the first engagement, or else the entire galaxy might fall. And yet, as the first human warships neared the battlefield, there was something in the air, something unmistakable, even to the untrained eye. The Zorn weren't ready for this. No, they weren't prepared for humanity's willingness to sacrifice everything for a chance at survival. The human ships, small but agile, began to maneuver into position. Donovan's officers worked tirelessly, refining their plans, adjusting their tactics on the fly. The Zorn were going to expect a straightforward fight, one where brute force and overwhelming numbers would decide the victor. But Donovan had something else in mind. "Prepare for Phase 1, she ordered. "All ships, move into formation. We're going to make them rethink everything they know about war." The first salvo of human fire sent a ripple of confusion through the Zorn lines. It wasn't powerful. It was barely a scratch against the enemy's massive shields. But it was a signal. The Zorn couldn't predict what would come next, and that unpredictability, their greatest strength, was now humanity's greatest weapon. As the first wave of human ships sped toward the Zorn, it became clear that this was no ordinary engagement. The humans weren't playing the same game. Admiral Donovan stood firm at the helm, her hands gripping the command console, her thoughts racing. The next 5 hours would be the most critical in the history of the galaxy. Would humanity's unrelenting will and resourcefulness be enough to face the Zorn's overwhelming power? She knew one thing for certain. They were going to make a mark that no one would ever forget. As the human fleet emerged from the warp and into the heart of the Coalition's home system, the scale of the war hit them like a wall. The scene before them was one of pure chaos, an endless expanse of smoke and fire where the Coalition's once pristine defenses had been reduced to rubble. Zorn warships, massive and intimidating, loomed in the black void, their weapons flashing with deadly precision as they tore apart whatever remained of the Coalition fleet. At first glance, it seemed like there was no hope. The Zorn were everywhere, overwhelming in both numbers and sheer destructive power. Admiral Donovan's breath caught in her chest as she watched the devastation unfold on the tactical display. The Zorn had already breached the capital world's atmosphere with orbital bombardments, sending shockwaves through the planet's surface. Earth's fleet had arrived too late to prevent the immediate destruction, but not too late to fight back. Donovan's voice cut through the comms, firm and commanding. "All ships, focus on defense. We're not here to retreat. We're here to make them remember us." Her fleet of ragtag ships, though outmatched in firepower, had one distinct advantage: agility. The Zorn were accustomed to fighting with overwhelming force, massive warships and sophisticated weaponry that had wiped out entire fleets in the past. But humanity's ships were nimble, designed for exploration and fast response missions. They had no place in a galactic war, but that was exactly what would make them dangerous. The first skirmish was brutal. Human ships darted and weaved through the battlefield, dodging incoming plasma fire with incredible precision. A squadron of Zorn bombers locked onto the Resolute, Donovan's flagship, unleashing a torrent of energy blasts. For a moment, it seemed as though the humans would be overwhelmed. But then, to the surprise of the Zorn, the human ships pulled off impossible evasive maneuvers, flying in unpredictable patterns that no one, not even the Zorn, could foresee. On board the Resolute, Lieutenant James Riker gripped the controls of a fighter ship, sweat pouring down his face as he jinked and dodged through the chaos. "They're not following any protocols. What the hell is this?" he muttered into his comms as the Zorn pursued him with relentless aggression. Unlike the cold, calculated nature of Zorn tactics, the humans were chaotic, almost erratic. No two maneuvers were the same, no pattern to their movements. The Zorn were used to outgunning their foes with sheer firepower, but these humans seemed to have a strange resilience, an adaptability the Zorn had never encountered. Back on the flagship, Donovan watched as her crew worked furiously to adapt their tactics. "Jammers online," one of her officers reported. "We've blocked their targeting systems, ma'am. Their lock-ons are useless." "Good," Donovan said, her voice cold but resolute. "Now it's time to hit them where it hurts." The humans began launching their counterattack. They couldn't match the Zorn ship for ship, but they could outthink them. Using makeshift electromagnetic pulses, the humans disabled a number of Zorn weapon systems, turning their own technology against them. A few of the Zorn ships went dark, drifting aimlessly as their core systems crashed. A ripple of disbelief spread through the Zorn ranks. The humans weren't supposed to be this effective. They had no advanced weaponry, no matching numbers, but they had something that could break even the most established battle doctrine: resourcefulness. For the first time in the war, the Zorn were facing something they hadn't prepared for: an enemy that didn't play by their rules. Across the battlefield, the coalition's remaining forces began to rally. They had watched in stunned silence as the humans turned the tide of battle. The Zorn had expected a short final skirmish, but the humans had not only arrived, they had made an immediate impact. Donovan surveyed the battlefield from the bridge of the Resolute, watching the swirling chaos of combat. There was no time to rest. They had just begun. But she allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. The Zorn were confused. They didn't understand. The battle had barely begun, but already something remarkable was happening. The Zorn, who had once seemed invincible, were now struggling to comprehend the chaos unfolding before them. It wasn't that the humans were winning outright. It was that the Zorn were suddenly unsure of their superiority. The human ships, outgunned and outnumbered, didn't follow any predictable patterns. They didn't fight according to any established tactics. And in the world of war, unpredictability was a weapon in itself. On board the Resolute, Admiral Donovan stood at the command console. For the first time in the war, the Zorn were no longer the ones in control. And this was just the beginning. The battlefield had become a swirling, chaotic storm of destruction, but something profound was unfolding. The Zorn, once the epitome of military superiority, were struggling to maintain control. They had never encountered an enemy like this. The humans, small, unrefined by galactic standards, and outmatched in every way, had turned the battlefield into a puzzle, with the Zorn scrambling to keep up. Admiral Donovan watched as the Zorn began to lose their cohesion. Their once immaculate formations were now shattered, their ships moving erratically, each one attempting to compensate for the damage they had sustained. It was a subtle shift, but one that would make all the difference. The humans had never intended to fight them head-on. Instead, they had focused on sowing confusion, dismantling the Zorn's control over the battlefield piece by piece. And now, the Zorn were on the back foot, their confidence unraveling. "Status update," Donovan demanded, her eyes fixed on the swirling chaos displayed on the tactical board. "We've disabled the Zorn command ships," reported Commander Harris. "Several of their dreadnoughts are immobilized, unable to engage properly. Our fighters are coordinating strikes on their engines and power grids." The Resolute shuddered as another burst of fire came close, but it was quickly followed by a series of explosions across a nearby Zorn destroyer, which went dark, drifting helplessly as its power grid collapsed. "They're scrambling," Harris added, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I don't think they can adapt to us as fast as we're adapting to them." "Good," Donovan said, her voice as sharp as ever. "Keep the pressure up. We're not done yet." On the battlefield, the humans pushed forward with reckless precision. Riker and Green's squadron was at the heart of it, weaving through the wreckage of Zorn ships and picking off targets with surgical efficiency. They were small, nimble, and most importantly, they were unpredictable. Zorn ships, with their enormous weapons and rigid tactical patterns, had never been designed to react quickly to something as erratic as human maneuvering. "We've got them in a bind," Riker, Green called over the comms. "Their fighters are trying to follow us, but they can't keep up. Every time they lock on, we're gone." Riker grinned, adrenaline pumping through his veins as he dodged another burst of plasma fire. "Let's keep them guessing. If they think we're predictable, we'll show them how wrong they are." The human ships were taking losses, of course. Nothing about this fight was easy. But the Zorn were losing far more. Every time they tried to engage, another surprise awaited them. And with every lost ship and disabled dreadnought, their morale dropped further. The Zorn had never experienced fear in battle. They were bred for war, taught to crush their enemies with overwhelming force. But now, for the first time, they were beginning to question whether this war was truly winnable. As the hours stretched on, the tide of the battle began to shift decisively in humanity's favor. The Zorn fleet was no longer a unified front. It was splintering. Their once pristine warships, sleek and powerful, were now drifting or retreating, unable to keep up with the relentless attacks from the human fleet. The human forces, though outnumbered and outgunned, had managed to achieve what seemed impossible. They had destabilized the Zorn's perfect war machine. Donovan stood tall on the bridge of the Resolute, her hands gripping the edge of the command console as she observed the chaos on her display. Her face was grim, but there was a flicker of something else. Hope. Humanity wasn't just surviving. They were starting to win. And though the Zorn were still a formidable force, there was no question now. The humans had proven they could outthink, outfight, and outlast their enemy. "Commander," Donovan said, her voice quiet but resolute, "prepare the final phase. We're going to finish this." Her plan had always been to break the Zorn's will. And now the enemy was on the brink of that breaking point. The Zorn weren't used to being on the defensive, and their inability to cope with the human tactics was unraveling their strategy. The next phase wouldn't be about overwhelming force. It would be about capitalizing on the cracks that had formed in the Zorn's confidence. All around the battlefield, the human ships continued their unpredictable assault. A final, coordinated wave of attack ships surged forward, aiming directly for the Zorn's core command ships. It wasn't just about destruction. It was about delivering the final blow to their psyche. The Zorn might have underestimated humanity at the start. But now, as their fleets scattered in disarray, they were learning the painful lesson that the price of that mistake was steep. The humans weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting to prove that against all odds, they could stand and win. And the Zorn, for the first time in centuries, were beginning to doubt their own supremacy. The battle had reached a fever pitch. The Zorn, once the galaxy's uncontested conquerors, were now in a desperate scramble. Their once imposing warships, the terror of countless worlds, were starting to fragment. Some had been reduced to drifting hulks, their power cores extinguished. Others were caught in disarray, trying to reorganize, but their communication systems were down. The battle wasn't over, but the Zorn were losing control. Admiral Donovan watched the unfolding chaos from the bridge of the Resolute, her mind racing. Every minute of this fight had been a testament to humanity's resilience and ingenuity, but they couldn't stop now. This was the moment that would define the course of the war. If the Zorn were given the time to regroup, to adapt, they could recover. Donovan wasn't about to let that happen. "Commander Harris," she said, her voice calm but forceful. "It's time. Initiate Phase 3. We take the fight to their heart." The tactical officer looked up from his console, his eyes filled with a mix of determination and awe. "Understood, Admiral. We're coordinating with the other ships now. We'll hit their flagship first." Donovan nodded, her focus unwavering. She could feel the pressure mounting. The weight of every decision now fell on her shoulders. The fate of the galaxy rested on a knife's edge. If the humans didn't act now, the Zorn might still find a way to turn the tide. On the battlefield, Lieutenant Riker's squadron was already in position. His fighter streaked through the chaos, weaving between exploding ships and dodging erratic fire. The human fleet had successfully disrupted the Zorn's command structure, but they were still powerful, still a threat. He knew their task: get to the heart of the Zorn fleet and strike at their command flagship, the Dread Tyrant. It was the linchpin of their operation. If the flagship fell, it would send shockwaves through the entire Zorn fleet. "Riker, this is Green. We're with you," came the voice of his wingman, her tone confident but tense. The squadron moved as one, a calculated swarm of agility and speed. Their goal was clear: to reach the Dread Tyrant, the command ship that held the Zorn's tactical control over the entire fleet. It was heavily guarded, of course, but the Zorn were beginning to panic, and the gap between their defensive systems and the humans' fast-moving assault was widening. A Zorn fighter squadron appeared ahead, but Riker and Green, anticipating the move, dove and barrel-rolled, evading the incoming plasma blasts with ease. They had perfected their tactics, and the Zorn, far too accustomed to their own overwhelming strength, couldn't keep up. "We're clear. Prepare to fire on my mark," Riker called over the comms. The Dread Tyrant loomed ahead, its massive form casting a shadow across the battlefield. It was a fortress, but even fortresses had weaknesses. The human ships had mapped out the Zorn's vulnerabilities during the early stages of the fight. The Dread Tyrant relied on a complex communication network to maintain control over the scattered Zorn fleet. If they could sever that connection, it would cripple the Zorn's remaining forces. "Lock on their central comm array," Riker ordered. His hands moved quickly across the controls, targeting the vulnerable signal hub of the Dread Tyrant. The squadron's weapons systems locked onto the target, and in unison they fired. The volley of missiles and energy blasts streaked across the void, slamming into the Dread Tyrant with unrelenting precision. The ship's shields flared violently, then flickered, finally collapsing under the assault. Riker's heart raced as he saw the comm array erupt into a spectacular explosion. The Dread Tyrant was no longer capable of directing the rest of the Zorn fleet. It was just another ship now, vulnerable and isolated. The shockwave rippled through the Zorn forces. Their flagship, once the symbol of their might, was crippled. It wasn't destroyed, yet, but its power to lead the remaining ships had been shattered. And with it, the Zorn lost their sense of purpose. "Phase 3 complete," Harris's voice came over the comms. "The Zorn are disoriented. Their coordination is collapsing." Donovan allowed herself a brief exhale. The hard part wasn't over, but this was a critical moment. The Zorn no longer had a unified command structure. Their fleet, once an unstoppable juggernaut, was now in disarray. The humans had struck decisively at the heart of the Zorn war machine, and the results were immediate. As Zorn ships faltered and fled, it became clear they were no longer the invincible force they once were. "All ships," Donovan's voice echoed through the comms, strong, and unwavering. Press the attack. We finish this now. No mercy. The human fleet surged forward, unrelenting. The Zorn might have been the galaxy's most feared conquerors, but humanity had just shown them that no power, no matter how overwhelming, was invincible forever. The war was far from over, but the Zorn had learned a crucial lesson. Humanity, when pushed to the brink, would rise with a ferocity they could never have anticipated. And now, they would never forget that lesson. The chaos of the battle had reached a fever pitch. The Zorn, the once proud empire that had swept across the galaxy with the cold efficiency of a predator, were now reeling, scattered, and confused. Their fleet, once organized and unstoppable, had become a mass of fragmented forces, each ship struggling to function without the centralized command it once had. The dread tyrant was no longer directing their movements, and now humanity was going to finish what they had started. Admiral Donovan stood at the bridge of the Resolute, her eyes fixed on the tactical display. The Zorn's power had been broken, but they were still dangerous. Their ships were battered, but they were not retreating. Instead, they were responding with a kind of fury born of desperation. The fight had reached a turning point, but the Zorn were not going to surrender easily. "Commander Harris, status report," Donovan ordered, her tone calm but sharp. "Their fleet is falling apart." "Admiral," Harris replied, his voice full of urgency. "We've disabled over half their warships, and their fighters are in disarray. However, we still have a few heavily damaged dreadnoughts making a last-ditch push toward our lines. They're not retreating. They're trying to break through and reorganize." Donovan nodded. "We don't have time to let them regroup. If we give them a chance, they'll rebuild their coordination, and we'll lose our edge. Initiate the final push." "Understood," Harris confirmed. "All ships, prepare for coordinated assault. Target the remaining dreadnoughts." Donovan turned her attention to the battlefield, watching the scattered remnants of the Zorn fleet. The humans had done what no one had thought possible. They had thrown the Zorn into disarray. But the last Zorn forces were now pushing forward, desperate to fight to the bitter end. Their pride, their arrogance, would be their undoing. On the battlefield, Lieutenant Riker's fighter squadron was once again in motion. His mind raced as he darted through the wreckage of Zorn warships. They were in the final stages of the battle, but it felt like a lifetime of fighting had led them here. The Zorn were still a formidable force. They had the weapons, the technology, and the firepower to wipe out entire fleets, but they were no longer organized. "Green, target the engines of the remaining dreadnoughts. We need to keep them from regrouping," Riker barked over the comms. "On it," Green replied. Her fighter twisted in midair as she locked onto a massive Zorn warship, its hull scared and smoking from previous strikes. The Zorn were still firing, but their aim was off, their tactics disjointed. The humans were faster, more agile, and more determined. Riker squeezed the trigger, sending a stream of missiles slamming into the weakened hull of a nearby dreadnought. The ship shuddered, its shields flickering before collapsing entirely. A massive explosion erupted from its engines, sending debris flying in all directions. "We've got one down," Riker shouted, his voice crackling with excitement. The tide was turning in their favor, but they needed to keep up the pressure. The remaining Zorn ships, those that hadn't already been disabled, began to split off into smaller groups, trying to make an escape. But the humans were relentless. The Resolute and the rest of the human fleet were closing in, preparing to deal the final blow. Donovan, watching the tactical display, felt a surge of satisfaction. The Zorn's once unshakable confidence had been shattered. They were retreating, broken, and vulnerable. And yet, she knew better than to underestimate them. The Zorn had one last card to play. The comms crackled, and a voice, low, guttural, and full of menace, broke through. "You think you've won, humans." The voice growled, the accent thick with an ancient arrogance. "We will never surrender. Even now, You do not understand what you are facing." It was a Zorn commander, somehow still broadcasting through the chaos. Donovan's expression hardened. She had expected a desperate final transmission, but the Zorn were not finished. They still had one last weapon at their disposal, their self-destruct protocol. "Commander Harris, track that signal," Donovan ordered sharply. "They're planning something." "We're already on it, Admiral," Harris replied, his fingers flying across the console. "It's a fleet-wide detonation signal. If they activate it, they'll destroy the remaining ships and take us with them." Donovan's mind raced. The Zorn were cornered, but they weren't going to go quietly. The self-destruct code had to be stopped, and fast. "Tell the fleet to focus fire on the lead ship. Disable it before they can trigger the countdown," she commanded. "We can't let them destroy everything." The humans weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the galaxy's future. The final push was now more than just a victory. It was a desperate fight to ensure that the Zorn's last weapon wouldn't be the end of them all. As the human fleet surged forward, the Zorn prepared for their final act of defiance. But the humans had one final trick left. They had learned to fight, to adapt, and most importantly, to win against all odds. Now they would prove it once and for all. The battlefield was now a graveyard of broken warships, debris, and the silent remnants of what had once been a massive and unstoppable Zorn fleet. Yet the war was far from over. As the human forces surged toward the Zorn's remaining dreadnoughts, the Zorn, cornered and desperate, had one final card to play: their self-destruct protocol. Admiral Donovan's eyes remained locked on the display, her thoughts racing. The Zorn were preparing to burn everything down with them. If they detonated their fleet, the resulting shockwave could cripple the human forces, leaving them vulnerable to whatever counterattack the Zorn might attempt once the dust settled. The stakes had never been higher. She wasn't about to let the humans lose everything they'd gained in the past few hours. "Commander Harris, status on that detonation signal," Donovan demanded, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "We're tracking it, Admiral. The signal is coming from their lead dreadnought. If we don't disable it soon, the entire fleet could go up in flames," Harris reported, his voice tight with tension. "We've got fighters heading to the lead ship now, but their defenses are still active. It's going to be close. Close is not good enough. We need to shut them down now," Donovan ordered, her eyes narrowing. "Coordinate with the rest of the fleet. I want all remaining firepower focused on that dreadnought. We don't stop until it's disabled." The Resolute pivoted as the command was relayed to the rest of the human fleet. Riker's squadron, alongside other attack craft, accelerated toward the Zorn flagship. They knew what was at stake. The last dreadnought, with its activated self-destruct code, had to be neutralized before it could send out the final signal. As Riker zoomed toward the massive warship, a cold sense of finality washed over him. He had seen his share of battles, but this was different. The Zorn had underestimated humanity, and now they would pay the price. He didn't care about glory or recognition. All that mattered was stopping the Zorn from taking the galaxy with them. "Locking on," Green's voice crackled through his comm, filled with determination. "We need to get in close. No room for mistakes." The squadron adjusted their trajectory, diving in on the lead dreadnought, now a vulnerable, yet still dangerous target. The Zorn's defenses had been compromised over the course of the battle. Its shields were weak, and its weapon systems were erratic. The human fighters, nimble and agile, darted through the gaps in the failing defenses, firing precise bursts of energy that targeted the ship's vulnerable components. "Missiles away," Riker shouted, watching as his payload rocketed toward the Zorn warship. The impact was immediate. Explosions ripped across the hull, sending shudders through the massive ship. But the dreadnought's core was still intact. It was still capable of detonating, still dangerous. "Focus fire on the command center," Donovan's voice came through the comms. "We need to destroy the command module before they can trigger the detonation." Riker's eyes locked onto the ship's central structure, a heavily shielded core surrounded by thick plating. It was the heart of the ship. One well-placed hit could shut down its command functions and stop the self-destruct sequence. He wasn't sure if they had time, but he knew they had no other option. "Green, take the left flank. I'll hit it from the right," Riker ordered, his hand steady despite the tension building in his chest. Together, they swooped toward the heart of the Zorn flagship, firing every weapon they had. The energy blasts and missiles pounded against the command module, weakening its defenses. They needed one last strike. With a deep breath, Riker released the last of his missiles, watching them streak toward the target. Time seemed to stretch as the missiles closed in on the command center. Just as the explosions erupted, Riker banked sharply, dodging a final retaliatory blast from the ship's weakened weapons. The explosion tore through the command module, and the dread Terran shuddered violently, the detonation signal going silent. The Zorn's self-destruct countdown had been halted, the entire ship's systems collapsing in on themselves. There was a tense moment of silence across the battlefield. Then, the Zorn fleet, which had been clinging to its last hope, began to unravel. Without the command ship, the remaining Zorn ships were blind, disorganized, and vulnerable. The human fleet pressed forward, striking the remaining vessels with surgical precision. Admiral Donovan watched as the Zorn ships, one by one, fell silent. The prideful conquerors, who had once believed themselves invincible, were now reduced to nothing more than drifting wreckage. The humans had not only broken their will, they had shattered their very essence as a fighting force. "Victory is ours," Donovan said quietly, as the weight of the battle settled over her. She looked out at the scattered debris, a mixture of triumph and exhaustion in her heart. Humanity had done the impossible. Against all odds, they had fought back an empire that had seemed undefeatable. And in doing so, they had proven something far greater than just their ability to fight. They had proven that, when pushed to the edge, humanity could rise, adapt, and outlast any force that sought to destroy them. The Zorn were finished, and humanity was just getting started.